Just on this point about but paid for financial advice, obviously an obstacle for people to do it often is the cost versus the perceived benefit. Well, this is my sort of personal take on that. I don't think I need financial advice, generally speaking. I will take it at that point because in our work, we get to speak to advisors and see the difference they can make by just modeling things in certain ways, looking at your income and how it might rise and fall over the years. It's really hard to do that without that expert sort of eye. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Personal Investor Podcast. I'm Ed Monk, and I'm joined today by Fidelity's Marianna Hunt to talk about the countdown to retirement and specifically what you need to be considering 10 years, 5 years, and 2 years for when you think you will retire. Before that, let me remind you that if you find this video useful or interesting, to please subscribe to the channel. Give us a like and leave a comment if you want to do that. And once you've subscribed, remember to hit that bell icon at the top of the page to turn on all notifications to make sure that you get new content as soon as it is released. That all said, Marianna, welcome along. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you, Ed?
I'm good, thanks. Now, the conversation we're having today, Marianna, is based on a whole series of articles that you've done that look at these different points in the run-up to retirement and the things that people need to be thinking about at each stage. The first of those is 10 years from retirement. So let's start there, shall we? The first thing you've highlighted in your articles is something concerning the state pension 10 years out. So what is that?
So one of the first things to do when you're 10 years out from retirement is to check your state pension forecast. And you can do that using the government website gov.uk. And 10 years out from retirement is a good time to do this because you still have the opportunity to make up any gaps in your state pension record. So usually you need at least 35 years of qualifying national insurance contributions to be eligible for the full state pension. Now, if you don't have that for any reason, for example, if you've had career breaks or if you've worked abroad, you can usually pay to make up those gaps with voluntary contributions. The other thing to check while you're there is your state pension age, because state pension ages have been rising and you don't want a nasty surprise if you think you're going to get it at one age and actually it's later than that.
Yeah, and on those contributing years, they don't have to have been years in work. They can be other periods out of work claiming benefits, etc. But obviously anyone that's for any reason might think that they haven't been making NI contributions for some period of time, maybe time out of work or what have you, self-employment perhaps. It's really worth checking that because the state pension is going to make up a really, really valuable chunk of income practically for everybody. Even if they have lots of savings on top, it's going to be really important. Okay, so the next thing, 10 years out, a couple of things we're going to take together. One is knowing how much you're worth. Your savings are worth, I guess. And two, knowing how much you'll need. Really, really fundamental questions for anybody looking to organise their retirement.
Yeah, these are critical. So let's start with how much you have. Now here you need to gather together all the info on your various savings and investment pots. And that includes any old workplace pensions you might have, any private pensions you've built up, as well as ISAs, savings accounts, and so on. If you have defined benefit pensions within this, then you'll need to figure out how much income they're going to pay you, from what age they'll pay out, and if that income will increase over time. So that should give you an overall picture of how much you have. Then you need to think about how much you're going to be spending in retirement. So have a think about what kind of lifestyle you want. And it's really helpful to bucket your spending into 3 categories. So the first one is your essential spending. That's spending that can't be avoided. So things like housing costs, council tax, bills. Then the next bucket is your discretionary spending or your more comforts. So that would be things like hobbies you might have or moderate spending on holidays. And the final bucket is your luxury spending. So big one-off ticket items, things like long-haul travel, financial gifts to family, and so on. So that should give you a picture of how much you might need over the course of your retirement. And when you're calculating that, it's really important to have a clear picture of how long you might live, because our own Fidelity research shows that people consistently underestimate their life expectancy, and they do it by a significant amount. And that could lead to unsustainable withdrawals in those early years of your retirement.
And when you pull all this stuff together, you kind of build a picture, don't you, of how much money you've got, how much you might need. Yeah. You might still need to translate what you've got into an income.
Yeah.
And there's things to help you do that. Calculators, Fidelity's got some calculators to help you do that, but there are others as well. It can be important. You don't need to have a kind of forensic answer to this, but just to know if you're on track broadly to meet those spending needs.
Yeah.
It's really useful to know that 10 years in advance when you've got a bit of time to do something about it.
Exactly.
And that kind of brings us on to our next, important consideration for people 10 years out, and that is to supercharge their savings if they possibly can. It might be a good time to do that, and you might have the opportunity to do it because of the kind of ages and kind of career sort of point that people are at.
You're right. So people often find that 10 years out from retirement, it is the period where they are able to save more for the first time in maybe a long time, because probably the kids have left home, so you're not funding expensive teenage lifestyles. Maybe your mortgage balance is starting to shrink. So that means you've got a really valuable window of opportunity to, as you say, turbocharge those retirement savings. And that might be in the form of topping up pensions, ISAs, or thinking strategically about how to use bonuses. And really important to remember that anything you contribute to your pension up to the annual allowance will benefit from tax relief.
Yes.
And particularly if you are a higher or an additional rate taxpayer, that
Absolutely.
will really turbocharge your savings, because the government will be topping up whatever you put in by 40 or 45%.
And I think at that point, when you're 10 years from retirement, before then, you might have had savings not into pensions, but just into ISAs or what have you. 10 years out, you can begin to see the point at which you can get your savings. In fact, 10 years from retirement, you might actually be able to access your pension money potentially. And so it doesn't feel like any kind of big sacrifice to put money into a pension at that point because, you can get it or you'll soon be able to get it. And when you look at the numbers of this, it's almost always the most advantageous thing to do financially, particularly if, as you say, you're contributing at one tax band and then you expect to go on to withdraw at a lower tax band. That's when the kind of benefits of putting into a pension really pay off, right?
Definitely.
Okay. Now, if people are supercharging their savings, one of the things they can do, of course, is maximize any workplace pension on offer. It's a simple thing. They get told to do it all the time, but it's free money, right?
It is. So this is particularly good if you've got a generous employer who will match any additional pension contributions you make. So some employers might say, if you put an extra, say, 3% into your pension, we'll put an extra 3% in too. And as you've said, this is essentially free money for future you. So by turning it down, you're turning down deferred pay, which why would you do that? The other thing to ask at this point is, can I contribute to my pension via salary sacrifice? Because that is a really tax efficient way to pay into your pension and can turbocharge your savings. Now, there are some changes coming ahead of us in 2029, but we still think it'll be a really tax efficient way to save even after that.
Yeah, and that's particularly true if you're around these, what people call cliff edges in the tax system. That's particularly around £100,000, which is a high amount to earn, but there's a big cliff edge in the tax system there. If you can sacrifice your salary down to that level and put it into a pension, it's a huge boost to your overall pension pot. Okay, finally then, for this stage of being 10 years out from retirement, we've got on the checklist reviewing investments and potentially consolidating what you have into one place. So what's important to bear in mind there?
Yeah, a decade away from retirement, that is a good point to check in with your investments and just make sure they are still suited to your risk appetite and suited to your time horizon, particularly if your retirement date has changed. And as you say, it can be a great time to consolidate because lots of us will have pensions and investments scattered all over the place in different accounts. And if you consolidate and bring them together, it can give you a clearer picture of how much you have, can help you develop a more coherent investment strategy, and potentially even reduce fees in the process. But the big caveat here is that you should definitely check if you're potentially giving up special benefits or incurring any exit penalties by consolidating. So think about that before you consolidate.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it can be fine to have lots of different pension pots as long as you know what they're all doing.
Yeah.
Consolidating, notwithstanding anything you might be giving up, in which case you perhaps shouldn't do it. But the advantage is just the visibility.
Yeah.
and the ease with which you can then tweak things from then on. Okay. We're going to fast forward to 5 years from retirement. I'm going to say at this point, by the way, if people haven't done these things at these points, it's not the end of the world, is it? You can still kind of catch up and do these things. Yeah. This is just kind of like, ideally, you want to be looking at these things at this time. Okay, so we move to 5 years from retirement. It's a given, I guess, that you should be maximizing contributions the whole time, really, at 10 years out. But again, at 5 years out, this can actually be a time when people begin to get windfalls for whatever reason. A lot of people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, actually, are going to be inheriting money from their parents. You've mentioned the costs that fall away at these sorts of ages. So hopefully there can be large one-offs going into savings.
Yes. And the other option might be if you've downsized your property and suddenly you've got proceeds from that. And if this is the case, then it's really important to bear in mind the carry forward rules you have around pensions. So usually you're able to carry forward unused pensions annual allowance from the past 3 tax years, which could mean you could make a big one-off contribution to your pension if you've got one of these windfalls. So that can be really beneficial.
Yeah, and lots of people do end up doing that. Especially, I think it's a combination of having the money to do it, but also being more keenly aware of what their retirement is likely to look like, and it can become quite attractive to do that. Okay, now this next one is really, really crucial. It's important to understand, isn't it, 5 years out, if not before, about the different ways in which you're going to be able to access your pension money. Even if you don't settle on one way of doing it at that point, knowing the different options is pretty fundamental to what the rest of your plan, basically.
Yes, this is critical. So there are several options through which you could access your pension, including lump sums, flexi access drawdown, buying an annuity, or a combination of these. And there are pros and cons to each, but whichever you choose, there will be implications for your tax position, things like longevity risk, but crucially, how you invest in that lead up to retirement. So for example, if you're looking to buy an annuity, then you probably want to be de-risking quite significantly the investments in your pension, because you don't want the value bouncing up and down just as you're about to swap the value of your pension for a guaranteed income for life. And on the other hand, if you're looking to access your pension via drawdown, you're going to be keeping that money invested for potentially 30, 40 years, maybe longer, and wanting to grow the value of your pot over that time. So maybe you don't want to be de-risking that much in that scenario. And as you say, it's not about knowing necessarily exactly which route you want to take 5 years out, but having a clear picture of what the options are will really help to shape your decision making and get you in the right position.
At that point about getting your investments right and the risks right, overspills into this next point, which concerns workplace pensions, because some workplace pensions will have you on a bit of a pathway, and you need to decide if that's right for you. But there's other practical points within workplace pensions that it's good to get on top of at this stage.
Yeah, so as you've said, a lot of workplace pensions will do something called lifestyling, where the risk of your investments in your pension will gradually decrease as you get closer to retirement. It's also known as a glide path. And they do this to stop, the value of your pension, decreasing significantly and being hit by a stock market crash as you approach that retirement date. But this only works if the retirement date selected on your workplace pension is actually correct. So if you've changed your plans, suddenly that date might be wrong and you might be taking either too much or too little risk with your pension investments based on this lifestyling. And the other thing to bear in mind is that lifestyling was originally based on the assumption that you would use your pension to buy an annuity. So if you are wanting to access it by a drawdown, it's worth going in there and checking, how is it invested? Is this how I want it invested? And 5 years out is a good time to do that.
Yes. Okay. Well, the next point, concerns tax, and particularly the 25% of a pension, potentially up to 25% of a pension that's available tax-free. It's important to begin to think about that, isn't it? And how are you going to use it in the future?
Yes. So, as you've said, usually you can take up to 25% of your pension tax free, up to certain limits. And how and when you take that money will have big implications for your tax position. And that's because beyond that 25%, withdrawals from your pension will be taxed as income. So, if you take a big withdrawal in a single year, that can really bump you up into these higher tax brackets, which you kind of want to avoid in retirement. So, this is a really good time to come up with a tax efficient plan for withdrawing your money. For some people, that might mean blending some pension income with some ISA income because the latter should be tax free. It might mean staggering pension withdrawals over a number of tax years and so on. So, there are lots of options, but basically, it is important to think about the tax position because that will have a big implication for how long your money lasts.
And on this point about a tax-free cash, there may be good reasons why you want to take it all and put it to use somewhere else, paying off debt, giving it to children, whatever you want to do with it, frankly. That can all be fine, but it's important to be considered about that. Okay, finally then on this this 5 years out stage, we've got a couple of very practical things. Well, one is booking a PensionWise appointment. So PensionWise, what is that?
Yes, PensionWise is a free government service where you can get impartial guidance if you're aged 50 or over on your retirement options. Now, really important to say this is not regulated financial advice, but what the PensionsWise can do is to set out your options quite clearly and talk about the pros and cons of various routes. Now, for some people, particularly if they've got a big pension pot or they've got quite complex circumstances, it could definitely be beneficial to speak to a financial advisor. And remember that this is probably one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make, and it could impact the next 30 years of your life. So it can be really helpful and give you peace of mind to get some structured support.
Yeah, and just on this point about paid for financial advice, obviously, an obstacle for people to do it often is the cost versus the perceived benefit. Well, this is my sort of personal take on that. I don't think I need financial advice, generally speaking. I will take it at that point because when in our work, we get to see that work close up and speak to advisors and see the difference they can make by just modeling things in certain ways, looking at your income and how it might rise and fall over the years and come in from one source and out from another. And it's really hard to do that without that expert sort of eye and professional eye. So think hard at this point about getting pro advice, I would say. Finally, Marianna, we get to the point where people are 2 years from retirement. Now, there's obviously less you can do at that stage in terms of contributing and making a big difference to your overall pot. But how should people be assessing their investments at that stage?
Yeah, this is really where you flip that switch from the sort of wealth accumulation stage to wealth preservation and income planning. And a key part of that is to make sure you're not exposing the income you're going to be relying on in your early years of retirement to excessive amounts of stock market risk. So a lot of people will take a bucketing approach to their income. So they'll have the first few years of retirement spending in very low risk assets, probably cash. And then they might have a medium term bucket, which might be more medium levels of risk with the
income generating.
Exactly.
Possibly, yes.
And then they'll probably have a final bucket, which is with their longer term income, where they can take a bit more risk still in the hope of better longer term returns.
Okay. Next at this stage, we've got refining your budget. I guess 2 years out from when you want to retire, you can actually sort of begin to feel it, right? And see really what life is going to be like and kind of have a firm grasp on what your day-to-day spending is likely to cost you. It can be important, can't it, to kind of actually come up with a budget at that point for your life after work.
Yes. And again, we come back to the benefits of separating that out into these three buckets of your essential spending, your discretionary spending, and your luxury spending, because that can give you a clearer picture of how much of your income how much of your spending, you want to underpin with guaranteed income. So an approach that I personally quite like is some people choose to underpin their essential spending and maybe some of their discretionary spending with guaranteed income, say in the form of the state pension plus an annuity. and then they rely on their investments to fund the rest of their discretionary spending and their more luxury spending, where you can be a bit more extravagant when stock market's doing well, and you can cut back on these things when the stock markets are not working quite in your favor. But obviously everyone will be completely unique, and that might not work for everyone. The other thing to bear in mind with your spending is that retirement spending isn't generally flat. So you'll probably be spending more in those early years. Then you might have a sort of quieter phase with a bit less spending, but it can also tick back up at the end if with things like later life care costs.
And if people mix their income sources, say with annuity in conjunction with investments, drawdown, or however they want to do it, one can help the other, can't it? Because if you know you've got your essentials covered through guaranteed income, you can worry a bit less about your investments, and you can just let them do their thing. You can take on the risks that you need to take on in order to get the benefits of them being invested in the first place. So one can kind of help the other, I think. Okay, finally then, we have the question at this point, 2 years out from retirement, of the longer term, which I guess means, what does very old age look like, and what does legacy planning look like as well? And it's a good time to think about that.
Definitely. So 2 years out, you will often be thinking about the early years of retirement and how you're going to spend those. But it's also, as you say, really important to think about your much later years of retirement. And that means doing things like reviewing your will, checking your pension beneficiary nominations to make sure those still reflect your current wishes, because a lot of people forget to do this. And it could also mean putting in place a lasting power of attorney if you lose mental capacity, and also thinking about your inheritance tax position. So consider, will your estate be over the inheritance tax threshold? If so, do you want to make any financial gifts? And when might you do that? Because we know the earlier you make those gifts, the more likely it is that they'll be free from inheritance tax if you meet that 7-year rule. But when you're doing this, you really need to think about balancing these considerations with the need to make sure your money lasts for the duration of your retirement. And with that last part, you really need to consider the potential costs of later life care should you need it. Now, it might be that you think about it and you decide, you know what, I'm comfortable spending my money. And if I do need care, I'm happy to go into council funded care. But it's just really important to have that conversation with yourself and actively make that choice rather than burying your head in the sand about care and then having the decision made for you.
Yeah, care is such a difficult one because there are no easy answers. If care costs come along, and they will for a significant minority of people, it can be easily enough to wipe out savings. It's quite hard unless you're uber wealthy to just have enough money on hand to not worry about that. However, there are always options around certain financial products that can help you. Care annuities can help you. Ultimately, it may require you sell a property if you are lucky enough to own a property. And that might just be the way it is, but it's worth having that conversation because that might affect what you can then pass on.
Yeah.
And it's better if, within families, that conversation has been had at a nice early stage. Look, Marianna, that was an absolute marathon of pension planning, but really, really useful, I hope. Okay, well, Marianna, that is all the time we have for now. I will just say that if you found this useful or interesting, to please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, leave a like, hit that bell icon to make sure that you get new content as soon as it is released. That all said, Marianna, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Ed.